What happens when a 19-year-old heir to generational wealth walks into a courtroom as if he's attending a casual social gathering? Dashiell Blackwood, a young man with platinum credit cards flashing from his designer wallet and custom Italian leather shoes that cost more than most families spend on groceries, in 3 months finds himself facing serious charges, stealing a Purple Heart medal from an 87-year-old Vietnam War veteran. But instead of showing any remorse, he live streams the proceedings to his followers, turning a criminal case into content for his lifestyle brand. And this is just the beginning. The courtroom is filled with tension on a Wednesday afternoon as Judge Caprio presides over the case. Dashiell Blackwood enters with an attitude of entitlement, completely unaware or uncaring about the gravity of the charges against him. With his flashy clothes and arrogant demeanor, he is the epitome of privilege, while the elderly veterans in the room exchange looks of disbelief and anger. Will Dashiell Blackwood, with his utter lack of respect for those who have sacrificed for this country, learn the hard lesson of honor and accountability from the court's harsh consequences? Or will he continue to live in the bubble of arrogance and privilege he's been sheltered in? Dashiell Blackwood's arrival in court wasn't just any ordinary entrance. It was a display of privilege and arrogance that made his presence feel like an insult to everyone in the room. As he swaggered into Judge Caprio's courtroom, there was no hint of remorse in his posture or demeanor. He treated the proceedings like a joke, more focused on how many people were watching him livestream on social media than the fact he was facing serious felony charges. At the heart of this case was a crime that was as shocking as it was disrespectful. Dashiell had stolen a Purple Heart medal, a symbol of sacrifice, courage, and honor, from a frail 87-year-old Vietnam War veteran, Colonel Frederick Barnes. The medal, earned during the Tet Offensive in 1968, was not just an object of military distinction. It was a reminder of the bloodshed by soldiers fighting for freedom and the comrades lost in battle. For Colonel Barnes, it was the most precious possession. He had a connection to a chapter in his life that had shaped him in ways no one could fully understand. Dashiell, however, didn't seem to care about any of that. When asked about his actions, he brushed them off with a callousness that stunned everyone in the room. "I was just visiting my great-aunt," he explained nonchalantly, "and saw this shiny medal sitting on some old guy's dresser. He was sleeping, so I thought I'd take it as a souvenir. It's not like he was using it. Old people don't need fancy medals anymore." His words hung in the air, fueling the growing anger of those who had witnessed firsthand the sacrifice that the Purple Heart represented. As Dashiell continued to downplay the severity of his actions, the courtroom buzzed with whispers of disbelief. How could someone so young and privileged be so completely disconnected from basic human decency? How could he dismiss something so sacred with such disdain? The veterans in the gallery exchanged looks of disgust, their faces a mixture of sorrow and rage at Dashiell's utter lack of respect. To them, the Purple Heart was far more than just a medal. It was a symbol of everything they had sacrificed for their country. Judge Caprio, who had witnessed thousands of cases, maintained a calm exterior, but it was clear from his expression that Dashiell's lack of empathy was hitting a nerve. The judge, known for his fairness and his ability to see through pretenses, calmly read through the details of the case. The evidence was undeniable. Dashiell had broken into Colonel Barnes's room at Sunset Manor Assisted Living, taken the Purple Heart, and damaged the veterans' personal belongings in the process. He had even mocked the elderly veterans, dismissing their military mementos as useless junk that younger people could appreciate better. "Is that accurate, Mr. Blackwood?" Judge Caprio asked, his voice steady but carrying an underlying tension. Dashiell, still dismissive, waved off the serious charges. "Yeah, but it's no big deal. I didn't know what I was taking. It wasn't even that important. Just some old guy's stuff." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about a theft. It was a theft of dignity, of honor, and of history. As Dashiell continued to minimize his actions, Judge Caprio's patience was wearing thin. The elderly veterans watching in the gallery were visibly upset, some standing up in protest, only to be asked by the judge to remain seated. It was clear now Dashiell Blackwood wasn't just standing trial for his actions. He was standing trial for his character. And the judge wasn't going to let him off lightly. As Dashiell continued to dismiss the charges against him with an air of entitlement, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from disbelief to palpable tension. The judge's patience was wearing thin, and yet Dashiell showed no sign of remorse or understanding. His behavior was a stark contrast to the solemnity of the proceedings, as if he had no comprehension of the gravity of what he was accused of. Judge Caprio, a man who had witnessed countless cases, had dealt with a wide range of defendants, but something about Dashiell's attitude struck a deep chord. He had seen arrogance before, but never from someone so young, so detached from the real world. Dashiell seemed to believe his family's wealth and status would protect him, but this time he was about to learn that money couldn't shield him from the consequences of his actions. With a look of growing frustration, Judge Caprio addressed the defense attorney Marcus Whitfield, who had been trying to manage his client's behavior. "Your Honor, my client is young and made a poor judgment in this situation," Marcus began. But before he could continue, Judge Caprio raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "Counselor, your client didn't simply make a poor judgment. He deliberately stole a symbol of honor and sacrifice." The judge stated firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. This wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theft, a theft of something sacred. The tension in the room was palpable as Dashiell's smug demeanor faltered for a brief moment. He glanced around the courtroom as if finally realizing the seriousness of the situation. But instead of showing any remorse, he simply shrugged as though trying to downplay everything. "Look, Your Honor, I didn't mean any harm. I was just having a look around the nursing home while visiting family," Dashiell said nonchalantly, as though his actions could be explained away by a mere excuse. "That old guy's room was full of junk from 50 years ago. I thought that medal was just some vintage piece of jewelry. It didn't even seem like something important. I was going to return it anyway." To returns. His words struck a nerve in the room, especially among the veterans who had gathered to witness the case. A few veterans stood up in outrage, their faces red with anger at the blatant disrespect. The judge, clearly disturbed by Dashiell's continued dismissal of the crime, allowed them to speak, urging them to voice their feelings. One veteran, a man with a weathered face and a deep voice, spoke out. "This young man doesn't understand the value of what he took," he said. "That medal represents the bloodshed in service to this country. It's not a trinket for decoration. It's a reminder of lives lost, sacrifices made, and the price of freedom." Dashiell rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed at the interruption, and muttered under his breath, "It's just a medal. Calm down, man." Judge Caprio turned sharply to Dashiell, his eyes narrowing with a cold fury that sent a wave of silence through the courtroom. "Mr. Blackwood, you are sitting here today not because you made a mistake, but because you disrespected something far greater than yourself," the judge said, his voice firm and unwavering. "You didn't just steal an object, you stole the dignity of a man who fought for this country. You mocked his sacrifice and his service." Dashiell seemed unfazed, but the judge wasn't done. "You see, Mr. Blackwood, while you've spent your life collecting wealth and status, Colonel Barnes has spent his life serving others, fighting for freedom, raising families, teaching generations of young people. And you think you can walk into this courtroom with a sense of entitlement and brush all of that off as if it means nothing." For the first time, Dashiell faltered. He looked at the judge, his arrogance fading just a bit as he began to realize the weight of his words. But instead of apologizing or acknowledging his wrongdoing, he tried once again to downplay the situation. "I didn't know his whole story. I thought he was just some old guy who liked collecting stuff." Dashiell muttered, his tone less confident than before. "I didn't mean to disrespect him." Judge Caprio's gaze hardened, his disappointment evident. "That's exactly the problem, Mr. Blackwood. You didn't bother to understand. You didn't care to understand. You saw an elderly man and his belongings as insignificant, and you took what didn't belong to you because you thought you could. And now you sit here trying to justify your actions with excuses that only reveal your lack of respect and empathy." The room was silent, the weight of the judge's words sinking in. Even Dashiell seemed to feel the shift in the atmosphere. But instead of breaking down or showing true remorse, he simply sat there avoiding eye contact, hoping this would all go away. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. He wasn't about to let Dashiell off the hook so easily. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said, his voice calm but filled with authority, "you've been given an opportunity to understand the consequences of your actions, and yet you still fail to grasp the significance of what you've done. It's not just about the medal, it's about the respect that comes with being a human being. It's about understanding that no one is above the law, no one is entitled to take what doesn't belong to them." Just when it seemed that Dashiell's disrespectful attitude could not get any worse, Judge Caprio took a step that would change the entire course of the trial and Dashiell's life. The judge, seeing that the young man was still unmoved by the gravity of his actions, decided to introduce Dashiell to the person whose life and sacrifice he had so carelessly dismissed. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Caprio, said, his voice steady. I want you to meet the man whose Purple Heart you decided was no more than a trinket. Colonel Barnes, would you please come forward? For the first time since entering the courtroom, Dashiell's smirk faltered. All eyes turned toward the front of the room as Colonel Frederick Barnes, 87 years old, rose slowly from his seat in the front row. With the help of a walker adorned with Vietnam War service ribbons and campaign medals, the elderly veteran made his way toward the witness stand. Despite his frailty, there was a quiet strength in the way he moved his bearings, still carrying the disciplined aura of a man who had once led soldiers into battle. Judge Caprio addressed Colonel Barnes with a level of respect that made Dashiell's earlier arrogance seem even more out of place. Colonel Barnes, thank you for being here today despite the circumstances. Please tell the court about the Purple Heart that was taken from your room. Colonel Barnes's voice trembled with age, but it was clear, dignified, and full of emotion. Your Honor. He began, his eyes briefly glancing at Dashiell. That Purple Heart was awarded to me in 1968. After I was wounded by shrapnel during the Tet Offensive near Da Nang. I was 23 years old, serving as a platoon leader with the 101st Airborne Division. The medal represents the blood I shed defending freedom and the brothers I lost in that war. The entire courtroom fell silent. The veterans in the gallery, who had been visibly upset throughout the trial, now sat in complete stillness. The words of the elderly man who had risked everything for his country carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Colonel Barnes paused, his eyes growing misty as he continued. That medal sits on my dresser not as a decoration but as a sacred reminder of sacrifice, service, and the young men who never came home. It is my most precious possession because it connects me to the most important chapter of my life, a time when I served something greater than myself. As Colonel Barnes spoke, Dashiell's smug expression began to waver. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but still there was no sign of genuine remorse. Judge Caprio looked at him with an expression of quiet frustration and then turned back to the colonel. When I woke up from my afternoon nap and discovered that my Purple Heart was missing, I felt violated in a way I hadn't experienced since combat. Colonel Barnes continued, his voice shaking slightly. This young man didn't just steal an object. He stole a piece of my soul, my history, my connection to fallen comrades. The room was silent as Dashiell's earlier bravado completely crumbled. It was as though the weight of the colonel's words was finally sinking in, but it still didn't seem to be enough to break through Dashiell's thick layer of entitlement. He had heard the words, but he wasn't really listening. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Caprio said, his voice now stern. You've just heard Colonel Barnes explain what that Purple Heart means to him. How do you respond? The judge's question hung in the air. But Dashiell, as though still trying to avoid facing the emotional truth, muttered dismissively, Oh, please, you're being totally dramatic. It's just some old piece of metal with a ribbon. You act like I stole your kidneys or something. He laughed awkwardly, but the room did not share in his amusement. Instead, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by shocked murmurs and whispers of outrage. Judge Caprio's face darkened, and his voice rose in authority. Mr. Blackwood, he said sharply, you will not interrupt or dismiss this witness any further. Colonel Barnes earned that Purple Heart by bleeding for his country, while you have earned nothing but your father's money. You will show respect to this man and to the sacrifice he made. Do you understand? Dashiell shrank back in his seat, but it was clear he still didn't fully grasp the depth of his actions. His attempt to justify his behavior with excuses about the medal's lack of value only highlighted how far removed he was from any true understanding of sacrifice and service. The judge, who had patiently allowed Dashiell to speak, now stood tall and addressed him directly. You, Mr. Blackwood, reduced a sacred symbol of military sacrifice to costume jewelry for your apartment. What do you have to say for yourself now? Dashiell's face turned pale as he fumbled for an answer, his usual confidence slipping away. Look, Your Honor, I didn't know his whole story. I thought he was just some random old guy with military collectibles. If I had known, Judge Caprio interrupted him, his voice now thunderous. That's the problem, Mr. Blackwood. You didn't care to know. You didn't care about this man's service or the sacrifices he made. You saw an old guy and thought his possessions were fair game. You didn't see a human being. And that is where you've gone wrong. Colonel Barnes, who had been listening quietly, now spoke again, his voice full of quiet dignity. The worst part wasn't the theft itself, Your Honor. It was the young man's attitude when he was confronted. He laughed and said, "We old veterans just collect useless junk." To hear him dismiss my military service and my Purple Heart as worthless, that hurt more than anything. As the colonel finished speaking, Dashiell sat there visibly shaken, but still unwilling to fully admit the extent of his disrespect. The room had witnessed an undeniable shift. Colonel Barnes had shown dignity, honor, and restraint, while Dashiell had shown nothing but privilege, arrogance, and disregard. With the emotional weight of Colonel Barnes's testimony still hanging in the air, the courtroom grew eerily silent. It was clear that Dashiell's earlier arrogance had faltered. But the question remained, would he truly grasp the severity of his actions and the profound lesson that was being laid before him? Judge Caprio, known for his measured yet firm approach, knew that it was time to deliver not only a legal verdict, but a moral one. He had heard enough from Dashiell's dismissive attitude and excuses. Now it was time for real consequences. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Caprio, began, his voice calm but firm. You've had the opportunity to hear from Colonel Barnes, to hear the pain that your actions have caused, and yet you still fail to fully understand the magnitude of what you've done. He paused, looking directly at Dashiell, whose earlier smugness had been replaced with a nervous uncertainty. The shift in Dashiell's demeanor was undeniable, but it wasn't enough. Today, this court has heard testimony from a man who fought for this country, who bled for the freedom you take for granted. A man who saw the worst of war, and who wears his scars not as a burden, but as a badge of honor. And what did you do? You took his most sacred possession, his Purple Heart, and you reduced it to nothing more than a shiny piece of metal for your apartment decor. The judge's words were sharp, each one landing like a blow, driving home the gravity of Dashiell's actions. As Dashiell sat there, his head slightly lowered in apparent remorse, Judge Caprio continued, "But remorse isn't enough, Mr. Blackwood. You don't get to undo the harm you've caused by simply saying sorry. You need to face real consequences. You need to learn the value of service, sacrifice, and respect. And that learning must come through action, not words." The tension in the room was thick, everyone holding their breath as the judge prepared to deliver his sentence. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Caprio said, after reviewing the security footage, reading the police reports, hearing from Colonel Barnes and the witnesses, and observing your complete lack of genuine remorse, I am imposing a series of penalties designed not just to punish, but to transform you. Your behavior was not a misunderstanding, it was criminal, and it was a violation of something sacred. You will learn what it means to serve others, to earn respect, and to truly understand the value of honor and sacrifice. The judge paused for a moment, his eyes scanning Dashiell's face before continuing. First, a fine of $15,000 for felony theft of military honors. Second, a fine of $5,000 for breaking and entering. Third, a fine of $3,000 for elder abuse and intimidation. Fourth, a fine of $2,000 for the destruction of personal property. The total monetary penalty is $25,000. Dashiell's face turned pale, and for the first time he truly seemed to grasp the weight of the consequences he was facing. The financial penalties alone were staggering, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. However, the judge continued, I am staying $15,000 of that total contingent on your complete and satisfactory performance of a comprehensive restorative accountability program. This program is specifically designed for entitled individuals who commit crimes like yours. It will require genuine commitment, authentic character development, and most importantly, demonstrated respect for military service over the next 18 months. The courtroom was quiet as Judge Caprio outlined the extensive requirements for Dashiell's program. First, you will complete 800 hours of direct service at the Providence Veterans Medical Center. You will assist with patient care, meal service, recreational therapy, and provide companionship for elderly combat veterans. No administrative tasks, no special treatment, and absolutely no shortcuts because of your family's wealth. Second, you will write detailed apology letters to Colonel Barnes, every resident of Sunset Manor, and every veteran currently receiving treatment at the medical center. These letters will be handwritten and reviewed by this court for sincerity. Dashiell was visibly shaking now, the reality of his situation setting in, but Judge Caprio pressed on. Third, you will research, write, and present a 10,000-word academic paper on Purple Heart recipients. You will study their sacrifices and the sacred nature of military honors, and you will present your paper to high school history classes throughout Providence. Fourth, you will attend weekly individual counseling sessions focusing on empathy development and understanding military sacrifice for 12 months. Your counselor will submit progress reports to this court. The list of requirements seemed endless, but Judge Caprio wasn't done yet. Fifth, you will personally fund a $50,000 scholarship program for children of Purple Heart recipients, administered through Veterans Affairs, with no mention of your name. Sixth, you will spend every Saturday for 12 months volunteering at veterans' memorial ceremonies and military funeral services, learning proper respect for military traditions. Dashiell looked completely overwhelmed now. The extent of the judge's sentence was unlike anything he had ever imagined. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Seventh, you will surrender all your social media accounts for 6 months and complete a digital detox program focusing on genuine human connection rather than virtual validation. Dashiell's voice cracked as he finally spoke, a tremor in his words. Your Honor, that's my entire life for over a year. I have college plans, social commitments, and family business expectations. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his voice low but powerful. Mr. Blackwood, Colonel Barnes had life plans too before shrapnel tore through his body in Vietnam. He had social commitments to fellow soldiers who died protecting your right to live freely. Your social commitments involve stealing military honors and mocking elderly veterans who sacrificed everything for your freedom. The words hit Dashiell like a ton of bricks. His earlier arrogance was completely gone now, replaced with a nervous uncertainty. He was facing a life-changing moment, and the reality of the consequences was finally setting in. Do you understand these terms and accept these requirements, Mr. Blackwood? Judge Caprio asked. Dashiell, now visibly shaken, nodded weakly. Yes, Your Honor. I understand. Then you are released to begin this process immediately. Your first shift at the Veterans Medical Center starts this Saturday at 6:00 a.m. sharp. Don't be late, don't make excuses, and don't you dare dishonor yourself or this court any further, the judge concluded. The following months were a whirlwind of hard work and personal transformation for Dashiell Blackwood. His life, once filled with privilege, entitlement, and an easy escape from consequences, was now consumed by a rigorous program designed to reshape his character and his understanding of respect, service, and sacrifice. The once imposing weight of the monetary fines seemed trivial compared to the real life-altering lessons he was learning. On his first shift at the Providence Veterans Medical Center, Dashiell arrived early wearing an old, worn-out uniform. He no longer had the luxury of designer suits or flashy shoes. The volunteers and staff at the center watched with skepticism, but Dashiell threw himself into the work. He helped veterans with everything from daily care to recreation, each moment demanding his full attention and respect. The work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but slowly Dashiell began to change. As he heard the stories of the veterans, men who had served, sacrificed, and lost so much, his own arrogance began to melt away. For the first time, he began to understand what real courage and sacrifice looked like. Throughout the months that followed, Dashiell faithfully fulfilled every part of his sentence. He wrote heartfelt letters of apology, not just to Colonel Barnes, but to every veteran whose life he had touched during his service at the medical center. He attended counseling sessions where he began to uncover the roots of his entitlement and the painful realization of how disconnected he had been from the struggles of others. His 10,000-word paper on Purple Heart recipients became an eye-opening journey into the lives of soldiers who had fought for freedom, who had endured unimaginable pain, and whose stories were far greater than any material wealth could buy. The final test of his transformation came when Dashiell returned to Judge Caprio's courtroom 1 year later for his final review. The young man who had walked into that same courtroom 12 months ago, a symbol of arrogance and privilege, had been replaced by someone unrecognizable. Gone was the smug smile, the flippant remarks, and the sense of superiority. In his place was a humble young man who had learned to listen, reflect, and most importantly, serve. Judge Caprio reviewed the documentation. Dashiell's service hours, his progress reports from counselors, his interactions with veterans, and the feedback from those who had witnessed his growth. Mr. Blackwood, the judge began, his voice calm yet filled with pride. Your service supervisors describe your work as exemplary. Your counselor reports significant progress in empathy and respect for military service. Most importantly, Colonel Barnes and dozens of veterans have praised your dedication and authentic character growth. Dashiell stood in front of the judge, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Your Honor, he said, 12 months ago, I believed wealth made me superior, and age made people worthless. I was wrong about everything. Working with the veterans taught me that honor comes from service, strength comes from sacrifice, and character comes from protecting those who need protection. His voice cracked slightly as he continued. I met Purple Heart recipients who survived wounds I can't imagine. They rebuilt their lives after losing limbs, and they continued serving their communities long after military service. They taught me that respect isn't something you inherit, it's something you earn through how you treat people, especially those who sacrificed for your freedom. Dashiell paused, looking directly at Colonel Barnes, who was present in the courtroom once again. I can never undo the violation I committed against you, Colonel Barnes, or erase the disrespect I showed to military sacrifice. But I can promise to spend my life using whatever privilege I have to honor veterans and ensure their service is remembered with the respect it deserves. Judge Caprio nodded his face, reflecting satisfaction. Mr. Blackwood, you entered my courtroom as an entitled criminal who measured worth by wealth and youth. You're leaving as a young man who understands that character comes from service, respect comes from humility, and true honor comes from protecting those who protected us. As Dashiell left the courtroom, the weight of his actions and their consequences had been replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. He was no longer the arrogant young man who had walked in months ago. He was someone who understood the true meaning of sacrifice, respect, and humility. Later that day, Dashiell walked past Colonel Barnes in the courthouse hallway. The elderly veteran looked at him not with anger, but with quiet sorrow and a glimmer of hope. Son, Colonel Barnes said quietly, I pray you learn to understand what honor truly means. Dashiell stopped in his tracks, looking at the weathered face of the man he had wronged, the Purple Heart ribbon still visible on the colonel's jacket. For the first time, Dashiell truly saw him. Colonel Barnes, he said softly, I'm sorry. I really am. The colonel nodded, his voice steady as he replied, Apologies are words, son. Show me through your actions that you understand why that medal matters. 12 months later, Dashiell's life had been irrevocably changed. His actions spoke louder than any apology. His character had been forged through service, and he had earned the respect of the very veterans he once mocked. He had learned what it meant to live a life of honor, not because of his wealth, but because of his willingness to give back, to understand, and to respect those who had sacrificed so much for the freedoms he had always taken for granted. And so Dashiell Blackwood began a new chapter of his life, one defined not by arrogance, but by humility, not by entitlement, but by service. His transformation was proof that even the most entitled among us could change if given the chance to truly understand the meaning of sacrifice, honor, and respect.